The work on conflict resolution and mediation has become more complicated, more multifaceted, and I would say more difficult for us mediators. You have a tendency in conflicts today to make them ethnic and religious. The ethnic and religious dimension adds an emotional element to conflicts. And unfortunately, ruthless leaders exploit those ethnic and religious differences, leading to polarization inside nations, and makes it more difficult technically to come out with formulas as a diplomat. The second complication is that growingly conflicts become what I would call proxy wars. In other words, other nations outside the conflict area get involved, and they battle their own interests vis-à-vis other parties. So in the case of Syria, for instance, you have a conflict on the ground between the parties in Syria, but you also then have the regional tensions, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then at the UN Security Council, which I have followed very closely, you see the differences between great powers, United States and Russia. So the conflict cannot be solved unless you have solutions on all three levels. And that has not happened, tragically. And then, of course, lastly, there is a new element coming in which I didn't think was going to be the case, namely the risk of nuclear proliferation, nuclear threats becoming a reality. Development of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, which are at least of the size of Hiroshima bombs, and the growing risks recently around Korea, and of course the unfortunate departure of the United States of the Iran agreement has caused a situation where the nuclear issue has to be part of any security analysis. Well, there are perils on different levels. You have the perils related to conflicts, and we have horrible conflicts going on right now. Syria, Yemen, which is a huge tragedy with enormous suffering. And you have conflicts in Africa going on. South Sudan, I've been working with those issues for a long time. So conflicts is, of course, one such area of concern. The second one is more existential generally, and that is the climate change, the climate disruption rather, which is so obvious now that we are not living at peace with nature. We have droughts, we have floods, we have hurricanes of a magnitude which we haven't seen for a long time, and that we should see that as a warning sign that we must come to terms with the way we live and work. We must go in the direction of sustainability and respect of the borderlines in nature. And we have now a new tool in our hands. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that were negotiated for 4.5 years. I wear the pin here in front of you, reminding us that we have actually a toolbox to repair the world, namely these goals and the Agenda 2030. And that is also a way to implement the Paris Agreement. I'm sorry that we have seeing some major parties now leaving the negotiation results. But I think the trend is still there. We have to move definitely in the direction of implementing the Paris Agreement, but I think we need also take one step further. We need to aim for 1.5 degrees. It's urgently needed, and I think recent research proves that. And the third danger, which is harder to describe, but it has to do with the climate for political debate in our societies. Mainly in our democratic societies, I see a growing polarization, a growing us and them syndrome, a growing tendency by some to look at the outside world as a problem rather than as a possibility, whether it is merchandise and goods coming in, or whether it is ideas coming in, or whether it is human beings coming in, refugees, migrants. And if that is the case, that you start to look at the outside world as a problem, I think this goes completely counter to the historic trend of globalization, of realization that we need to find solutions together. So those are the three threats and perils I see. But I'm not a fully a pessimist, so I could also give you some reason for hope. And these hopes will be, in main terms, first of all, the role of women, which I think is one of the greatest promises historically, that women will have their full empowerment, rightly so, finally, for the first time in history. It has to come. I've seen it in Africa, I've seen it meeting female presidents of the world, going to parliament, seeing women. I see it in the schools around my own country. The girls are out there. And the universities, we have more university degrees coming out with girls now, with girls coming out of them. So it's coming. That, I think, is a great hope. The second one is young people. And there I think we need to learn to work not only for young people, but we need to work with young people. We should take advantage of their ideas, their idealism, their dreams, their aspirations, and try to channel that into our society soon. Because if we don't do that, we will have a generation that doesn't accept the institutions that we have built, the democratic discourse, joining political parties to select your representatives in a popular democracy. And I think if we try to work more with rather than not only for, we need to do a lot for also, is going to be a very crucial thing. And then, of course, knowledge, the third hope, knowledge, science, technology, just simply learning more. And I think the new technology coming in through the communication area is important, although I see many risks with that also. But I think knowledge is going to be a very liberating force. When I mediated in the 80s, 90s, I traveled around Africa and Asia, Middle East particularly, and people in the villages and towns didn't know what was going on outside their own countries. Now you push a button and know exactly what goes on in your own country and outside. So knowledge, I think, is the third reason for hope. And the fourth reason for hope is international cooperation. I believe in the United Nations as an idea. I'm not an uncritical friend of the UN, but it's a symbol of the word together and the global community, the global village in which we live. And then I'm a great friend also of diplomacy. We need to really use the word, use the method of peaceful settlement disputes. We don't do that enough today. We have a lack of dialogue and we have a trust deficit, which is actually dangerous. But I still think if you noticed, I have 4 reasons for hope and only 3 reasons for despair and seeing perils. So I'm still an optimist, although I would say that I'm today more of a troubled, worried optimist than an unconditional optimist. It is an extremely important approach to see problems from different perspectives. Security cannot be divorced from development. Development cannot be divorced from security, and neither development nor security can divorce from human rights, well-functioning institutions, good governance, rule of law. So we live in a world now when we are to solve the problems, we need to put the problem in the center and then ask what are the different actions needed to solve these problems. And then you will find that it is a range of issues. And therefore, I think OSCE's approach with adding all these dimensions, political, economic, environmental, social, and so forth, are absolutely crucial. And it also shows the importance of making a sharp distinction between international and national. You can't say that there is a clear border between the two. How can you draw a line on national and international on issues like climate change, climate disruption, or migration? It's by definition impossible. So in other words, this approach of seeing the issues horizontally rather than in silos and vertically is going to be the best way to solve problems for the future. That in combination with prevention, early action, will be the two recipes I would give for how to approach today's problems. So I think that's the direction we have to go. Well, I want to go back to the creation of OSCE. I was a young diplomat around the time of the Helsinki meeting when the final act was adopted. And I felt at that time that something historic was underway, because there was an approach that we had to do something about this horribly rigid Cold War borderlines between us, East and Western Europe. And the only way to do it was to go from area to area and see how you could increase contacts and dialogue. And we created, well, I was so young, it wasn't we, they created three so-called baskets: security, economic cooperation, cultural cooperation, and people-to-people contacts. And I claim now, looking back at 1975, seeing what OSCE was doing on observers, at military operations, at all the different, expanding the concept of security, was actually the beginning of the end of the Cold War. I think the period of ending the Cold War is between 1975 and 1989. So OSCE has a very important part in that process. And in the same way, United Nations has also, although somewhat belatedly, I must say, come to the same conclusion that you cannot divorce security from development and human rights and rule of law. That's how you reach the dynamic effect of what you do, and also the long-term stability of efforts. You cannot just think that you end a war like that. You need to have processes of making society function well and dividing resources and riches among people to have a stability in the country. So I would say that regional arrangements like OSCE is part of the UN, and it is actually part of the UN. I have in my pocket here the UN Charter, and people do not know that in this UN Charter there is a special chapter on regional arrangements. So, welcome to the UN. Well, I'm very proud to be a chair of the governing board of SIPRI. SIPRI was created in 1966. Sweden had at that time lived in peace for 150 years. So the Swedish Parliament created this as a celebration of 150 years of peace. We are now far beyond 200 years, fortunately. But it was created to be an independent international institute that would provide evidence-based facts on issues related to armaments, disarmament, arms transfers, and so forth. Mostly what was at that time called hard security. There we have become quite an authority. The SIPRI yearbook is a well-known source of evidence-based facts. But we have also broadened our agenda recently, in the last 5-6 years, also with inspiration coming from New York and the work on the Sustainable Development Goals, to work with the relationship, peace and development. We have had regular fora on that in Stockholm, 5 years now. The third thing that we want to do as an organization which is outside the official realm is to provide a venue for dialogue between parties who do not speak to each other. I cannot speak at length about that, but we are active in certain trouble spots, conflict areas, and trying to establish contact outside the official circles to reduce tensions and create dialogue. Well, Resolution 1540 is certainly, I would say, even more relevant today than it was in 2004, when it was adopted unanimously by the Security Council. the 5 permanent members voted all together yes to this resolution. The reason I say this is that the non-proliferation issue is more serious than ever. We have had the discussion around North Korea and Iran. The JCPOA agreement, I think, was a great step forward. I regret very much it is one party now has left the agreement. But I think the non-proliferation has become even more important today. And the other reason is that terrorism has grown as a threat in several parts of the world. It's a global phenomenon, and with the new technology emerging, for instance, drones and so forth, and the possibility of creating smaller weapons of mass destruction, and in the biological and chemical field, it's obvious they exist. But now there's even talking about smaller nuclear weapons. All this shows that we have a growing danger to that these weapons will be in the hands of terrorists. So we need to deal with that, apart from the serious work that we have to face, namely that we also have to look at the causes and roots of terrorism. But 1540 is certainly extremely relevant, and I'm glad the Swedish mission here, delegation here, took this initiative of putting 1540 on the table, because it is such a good example, both of how you have to look at the issues both from the global, regional, national level, but also look at it in the present climate and the present trends on technology, including cybersecurity, by the way.